The Upscale restaurant, known as Clair, was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the wealthy and powerful dined under soft golden light reflecting off crystal chandeliers. The atmosphere was heavy with the aroma of truffle-infused dishes, quiet piano melodies wafting from the corner of the room. For years, it had been an unspoken rule that only those who belonged to a certain echelon of society were welcome. Tonight, that unspoken rule was about to be tested. The doors to the restaurant swung open, letting in a gust of cool evening air that disrupted the carefully curated ambience. Conversations paused as patrons glanced toward the entrance, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected disturbance. Standing in the doorway was a striking woman dressed in casual yet elegant attire. Her dark curls framed a face both regal and serene, her presence commanding attention even without effort. She stood tall, her posture exuding confidence as she scanned the room. Behind the podium near the entrance, a young waiter named Ethan furrowed his brows. Clair had a reputation to maintain, and to him, this woman, despite her obvious poise, did not fit the mold of their usual clientele. He adjusted his tie nervously, trying to mask his unease as he approached her. "May I help you, ma'am?" Ethan asked, his tone carefully polite but laced with an edge of skepticism. His eyes flickered briefly over her attire, noting the absence of designer logos or extravagant jewelry. She smiled warmly, ignoring the subtle scrutiny. "Yes, I have a reservation," she replied, her voice calm and composed. "Serena Williams." The name struck Ethan as familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Still, he hesitated, his mind racing. Clair's clientele were typically politicians, tech moguls, and celebrities whose faces graced the covers of luxury magazines. He decided she must be mistaken. "I'm sorry, but this is a private establishment," he said, his tone firm now. "We have strict policies regarding reservations." Her smile faltered slightly, but her eyes remained steady, locked on his. "I am aware of your policies," she said simply. "I made a reservation." Ethan's discomfort grew. He could feel the weight of other staff members' gazes, as well as the diners who were discreetly watching the exchange. His voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. This isn't a typical restaurant." Serena's expression softened, though her tone carried a hint of firmness. "And I am not a typical diner. Perhaps you should check your reservations list again." Ethan's jaw tightened. He was young and ambitious, eager to prove himself in a job that required absolute adherence to the restaurant's exclusive standards. He turned toward the hostess stand, scrolling through the digital reservation system. "Serena Williams," she had said. The name was indeed there, marked with a VIP tag. Yet, instead of feeling reassured, he felt more suspicious. He glanced back at her, wondering if this was some kind of mistake or elaborate prank. "Excuse me for a moment," he muttered, stepping away to consult the restaurant manager. Mr. Hadley, the manager, was a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and sharper instincts. Ethan approached him with quick, deliberate steps. "Sir, there's a woman at the entrance claiming to have a reservation. Serena Williams. But she doesn't exactly look like our usual clientele." Mr. Hadley's brow arched as he glanced toward the entrance. He saw Serena standing there, her presence unshaken despite the growing tension. He recognized her immediately, though his reaction was not one of welcome. Instead, it was as if he had been handed a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. "Well, this is unexpected," Hadley said slowly. He knew the name Serena Williams. Who didn't? She was a global icon, a force of nature on and off the tennis court. But what was she doing here, of all places, and dressed so unpretentiously? It didn't align with the image he had of her or the clientele he meticulously catered to. Should I ask her to leave? Ethan asked, lowering his voice further. Some of the other waitstaff had begun whispering among themselves, the tension rippling outward. Hadley hesitated. No, let me handle this. Stay here. Straightening his tie, Hadley walked toward Serena with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to smoothing over delicate situations. Ms. Williams, he said, extending a hand. Welcome to Clair. My name is Richard Hadley, the manager. I understand there may have been some confusion at the door. Serena took his hand, her grip firm but polite. No confusion, Mr. Hadley. I have a reservation. Of course, Hadley said, though his smile did not reach his eyes. If you would allow me just a moment to confirm the details. Serena nodded, her expression unreadable. Hadley turned away, signaling discreetly to Ethan to join him out of earshot. Ethan, this is not just anyone, Hadley whispered urgently. But she's not exactly our typical guest, is she? He added, his voice tinged with doubt. What do you want me to do, sir? Ethan asked, torn between his instincts and his training. Before Hadley could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. Let her stay. Let's see how this unfolds. Both men turned to see a tall man entering the restaurant, his presence as commanding as Serena's. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he strode toward them with an air of authority that left no room for argument. He was one of Clair's most esteemed patrons, a tech billionaire whose name carried weight not just in the restaurant but across the city. Good evening, Serena, he said warmly, shaking her hand. I hope the staff has been treating you well. Ethan and Hadley exchanged uneasy glances, the realization dawning on them too late. This was no mistake, no confusion. Serena Williams was exactly where she was supposed to be. The tension in the room seemed to shift, the weight of unspoken judgments hanging heavy in the air. Serena's eyes met Ethan's briefly, her gaze neither accusatory nor forgiving. It was simply steady, unyielding. She turned back to the billionaire, her voice calm as ever. I'm here for the meeting. Shall we? Of course, he replied, gesturing toward a private dining room. As they walked away, Hadley and Ethan stood frozen, the full gravity of their assumptions settling in. The whispers among the staff grew louder, the patrons' curiosity unabated. And yet, amidst the murmurs and stolen glances, Serena never once looked back. She didn't need to. The lesson, though unspoken, was already beginning to take root. The private dining room at Clair was a world apart from the bustling main floor. Encased in soundproof glass and adorned with intricate wood paneling, it radiated exclusivity. A single chandelier hung above a long mahogany table, its soft light casting delicate shadows across the room. Serena Williams sat at one end, her composed demeanor unshaken, while the billionaire, Charles Armand, occupied the seat across from her. The tension from the earlier incident at the entrance lingered faintly in the air, but Serena seemed to pay it no mind. Her focus was on the purpose of her visit, and yet the unresolved undercurrents were impossible to ignore. Outside the room, the staff's whispers had not subsided. Ethan, still recovering from the embarrassment of his earlier misstep, stood by the service station, his thoughts racing. He had been trained to anticipate and cater to the whims of powerful individuals, but nothing had prepared him for this. The discomfort of his prejudice being laid bare gnawed at him, even as he tried to rationalize his actions. Mr. Hadley, ever the picture of composed professionalism, appeared at his side. "Ethan, a word," Hadley said, his tone low but firm. They stepped into a quieter corner of the restaurant. "You made an error in judgment tonight." Ethan's face reddened. "I didn't mean. I just assumed." Hadley raised a hand to silence him. "Assumptions have no place here. Do you understand who that is?" Ethan nodded, though the weight of his mistake had already settled. "I do now." Hadley sighed, his gaze drifting toward the private dining room. "This isn't just about a customer. It's about the image we project and the values we uphold. Fix this." Inside the dining room, Serena and Charles spoke in hushed tones. Their conversation focused on a new charitable initiative aimed at supporting underprivileged youth. Charles had always admired Serena's dedication to philanthropy, but tonight, he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in her demeanor. Though she maintained her characteristic grace, there was a quiet intensity in her eyes, as if the events of the evening had ignited a deeper resolve. "I'm sorry about earlier," Charles said, breaking the flow of their discussion. "That shouldn't have happened." Serena's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "It's not the first time, and it won't be the last. But that doesn't mean it's acceptable." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You handled it better than most would have." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I've learned that making a scene rarely changes minds. Sometimes it's better to show people their reflection and let them decide who they want to be." As their conversation continued, Ethan approached the door, a tray of refreshments balanced in his trembling hands. His heart pounded as he knocked softly and entered at Serena's invitation. The room seemed to close in around him as he stepped inside, the weight of his earlier behavior pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Ms. Williams, Mr. Armand, your drinks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He placed the glasses on the table with care, avoiding eye contact. "Thank you, Ethan," Serena said, her tone warm yet measured. As he turned to leave, she added, "A moment, please." Ethan froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. Slowly, he turned back to face her. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Serena gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Sit." Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously at Charles, who offered an encouraging nod. With a deep breath, Ethan complied, perching on the edge of the chair like a schoolboy summoned to the principal's office. Serena regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Ethan," she began, her voice calm but firm, "you made an assumption about me earlier." "Why?" He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he managed, I thought you didn't fit the profile of our usual guests." "And what is that profile?" she pressed, her tone free of accusation yet impossible to dismiss. Ethan's face flushed. We cater to a certain clientele. People who are wealthy, influential." "Do I not meet those criteria?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "You do," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I just didn't realize it at first." Serena leaned back slightly, her expression softening. "Ethan, I'm not here to humiliate you, but I need you to understand something. When you judge someone based on appearances, you limit not only their potential but your own. You close doors before they've even had a chance to open." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm sorry, Ms. Williams. I was wrong." "Apologies are a start," she said gently. "But growth comes from action. The next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations, take a moment to question those expectations. You might be surprised by what you learn." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Charles watched the exchange with quiet admiration, impressed by Serena's ability to turn a moment of prejudice into a teachable moment. Ethan rose to his feet, his posture straighter than before. "Thank you, Ms. Williams," he said earnestly. "I won't forget this." As he left the room, Serena turned back to Charles, her expression thoughtful. "It's not about shaming people," she said. "It's about giving them the opportunity to be better. Whether they take it is up to them." Charles nodded, his respect for her deepening. "You have a way of seeing the bigger picture, Serena. It's admirable." She smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "It's not always easy, but it's necessary. Change doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in moments like these." Outside the private dining room, Ethan returned to his duties with a renewed sense of purpose. The staff's whispers had quieted, replaced by an air of reflection. Serena's words had rippled through the restaurant, leaving an indelible mark on all who heard them. The night was far from over, but its lessons were already taking root. The night at Clair continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The private dining room doors remained closed, shielding the ongoing conversation between Serena Williams and Charles Armand from the curious eyes of the restaurant staff and patrons. Yet, outside those doors, the ripples of what had transpired earlier were far from subsiding. Ethan, now back at his station, moved with a noticeable air of determination, his earlier humiliation giving way to quiet resolve. The other staff members watched him with mixed emotions, some curious, others inspired by the subtle transformation. Inside the dining room, Serena and Charles wrapped up their discussion of the charitable initiative they were planning. Charles, ever the shrewd businessman, couldn't help but marvel at Serena's clarity of vision and her passion for giving back. But even as their conversation returned to lighter topics, Serena's mind lingered on the events of the evening. She was no stranger to prejudice, but each encounter still carried its weight. Tonight, however, felt different. There was an opportunity here, one she was determined not to let slip away. "Charles," she said, breaking a brief silence, "how often do you dine here?" Charles raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised by the question. "A few times a month," he replied. "Why do you ask?" She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table. "Do you ever notice the people who work here? The wait staff, the kitchen staff?" He hesitated, sensing the deeper implication behind her question. "I suppose I do, in passing. They're efficient, professional. But no, I can't say I've given them much thought beyond that." Serena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's the problem, Charles. We walk into places like this expecting perfection, and we rarely stop to think about the people who make it happen. And sometimes those people make mistakes. But how we respond to those mistakes says more about us than it does about them." Charles regarded her quietly, his respect for her deepening with each word. "You're right," he admitted. "So what do you suggest we do about it?" She smiled faintly, a spark of determination lighting up her eyes. "Let's start by having a conversation. Not just with the staff who were directly involved tonight, but with everyone. Let's make this a moment they can learn from, not just a story they whisper about." Within the hour, the restaurant staff were gathered in the main dining area. Patrons had been discreetly relocated to the upstairs lounge, and the once bustling space now held an air of anticipation. Serena stood at the center, her presence commanding yet approachable. Charles stood to her side, a silent but supportive figure. The staff, from waiters to kitchen hands, formed a loose semicircle around them, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. "Thank you all for taking a moment to join me," Serena began, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach everyone without losing its warmth. "I know this isn't how you expected your evening to go, and I appreciate your time." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "Tonight, something happened that, well, let's just say it wasn't ideal. But I'm not here to point fingers or place blame. I'm here because I believe in turning challenges into opportunities." Her words hung in the air, drawing the staff in. She continued, her tone steady and sincere. "Earlier this evening, I was mistaken for someone who didn't belong here. Now, I could chalk that up to a misunderstanding and leave it at that. But what good would that do? Instead, I want to talk about why it happened and what we can all learn from it." Ethan, standing toward the back, felt his chest tighten. He had braced himself for a public reprimand, but Serena's approach was entirely different. She wasn't lecturing. She was inviting them to reflect. "We all carry biases," Serena said, her voice softening. "Some are obvious, others are subtle. They come from our upbringing, our experiences, and the world around us. But here's the thing, those biases don't define us. What defines us is what we choose to do when we're confronted with them." She glanced toward Ethan briefly, her expression kind but purposeful. "Tonight, someone made an assumption about me based on how I looked. It wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. But every time it happens, I'm reminded of something my mother used to say: don't let someone else's limited view of you become your reality." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Serena's ability to turn her personal experiences into universal lessons was striking a chord. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "Now, I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs. From what I've seen, you're all incredibly skilled and dedicated. But I do want to challenge you to think about how you see the people who walk through those doors. Not just the ones wearing designer suits or carrying expensive handbags, but everyone. Because you never know who they are, what they've been through, or what they're here to do." Charles stepped forward then, his deep voice adding to Serena's message. "As someone who's been coming to this restaurant for years, I can say with certainty that the success of Clair isn't just about the food or the ambience. It's about you. Every single one of you contributes to the experience that keeps people coming back. And that means you have the power to shape that experience, not just for the patrons but for yourselves." The room fell silent, the weight of their combined words settling over the staff. Ethan, summoning his courage, stepped forward. His voice was shaky but sincere as he said, "Ms. Williams, I just want to say I'm sorry. For what I assumed, for how I acted. You didn't deserve that." Serena turned to him, her expression softening further. "Thank you, Ethan. Apologies matter, but what matters more is what you do next. And from where I'm standing, you're already on the right path." She extended her hand to him, and he shook it, his grip firm despite the tremble in his fingers. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension replaced by a sense of resolution. As the staff dispersed, returning to their duties with a renewed sense of purpose, Charles turned to Serena, a smile playing on his lips. You could have just walked out and left this place behind. Why didn't you?" Serena's gaze drifted toward the entrance, where the faint sound of laughter from the upstairs lounge could be heard. "Because walking away doesn't change anything," she said. "Staying does." Charles nodded, his admiration evident. "Well, you certainly changed something tonight. For all of us." She smiled, the weight of the evening's events finally lifting. "Change is never easy, Charles, but it's always worth it." As they left the restaurant, The staff watched them go, their whispers carrying a different tone now. Respect, inspiration, a story to tell, not just about a mistake, but about how it became a lesson. And above all, about the woman who had turned an uncomfortable moment into a chance for growth. A week later, a small plaque appeared near the entrance of Clair. It read, "A place for everyone." Beneath it was a simple inscription: "Change begins when we choose to see each other." If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters,